Is this on? Yeah, there it is. The Metro Roundtable, as Chris had mentioned, is really the densely populated area of the Front Range from the north side of the Arkansas Basin up to about Highway 7, which you've heard mentioned earlier today, as it's now closed. So you can't get out of the Metro Basin today. You've seen a few slides before also that showed that the South Platte has a gap. It's the largest gap in the state. And as part of the South Platte, the metro area has the largest individual gap of any area in the state. Looking forward to 2035 and beyond, the metro area is really, from our perspective, kind of where the problem lies, and we need to address that. We know that we have a tough hill to climb to make sure we get enough water supply for that area, but we're doing a lot of work to get there through our roundtable process and the Basin Implementation Plan. We are the biggest gap, but we're also the leaders on conservation and reuse. We're pushing the limits, maybe not to Las Vegas style, but we're pushing the limits for within what we think is feasible now for conservation and reuse. We are really working towards a balanced approach for how to implement the water plan and get the demand met for the future. We think it's really critical in the short term to push forward the IPPs that were identified in SWAZI. We think those are very important for making sure that the gap doesn't get any bigger. Beyond that, again, I think I've mentioned we want to pursue a balanced approach. We've had a number of conversations over the years even about how we look at not focusing solely on the Colorado River or on ag as a solution to our problem. And we're continuing to look forward to those discussions, work through the Basin Implementation Plan, and eventually rolling that up into the Colorado Water Plan.
Outstanding. Well done. Less than 3 minutes. Michelle.
Thank you. The Gunnison Basin Roundtable is also undertaking efforts to develop its Basin Implementation Plan. We have just begun that effort. In fact, we just initially discussed it at our last meeting. Like the metro area, like the South Platte, the Gunnison Basin also has a shortage or a gap in the Gunnison Basin that's largely associated with agriculture. In our initial discussions, I can say that it seems that our priorities will be centered around protecting our existing uses, identifying ways to solve that gap in agriculture, and also how to preserve the economy of our area, which is largely based in tourism and requires water for non-consumptive uses such as recreation and the environment. Beyond that, I'd say one of the most exciting things that we've done recently is our educational committee has developed and circulated the handbook for inhabitants of the Gunnison Basin. I hope all of you have had a chance to look at it. It's a very well done piece, much to the credit of several of the members on our roundtable and the editing skills of George Sibley. I think I'm just going to end it there. The work has just begun. We see serious challenges ahead of us in developing our Basin Implementation Plan, not only developing it, but also being prepared to promote and defend it. Thank you.
Good. Joe?
All right. I sit on the South Platte Basin Roundtable, and we're the other part of the South Platte that's not the metro, which includes the upper mountain counties. We call below the metro, and then all the way down to the lower South Platte to Nebraska, and then we also have the Republican Basin in our roundtable, which is near the Yuma Ray area, and they have their own issues there as well. When we started looking at our Basin Implementation Plan, we really felt that we wanted to join forces with the metro, because I think so often all this gets lost in dividing out and carving out the metro from the South Platte. Really, we have a large combined problem as the South Platte Basin as a whole. So we really want to look at an implementation plan that includes both the South Platte and the metro. If they're the problem, we on the lower South Platte are the sacrifice zone, I guess, if you will, from an irrigated agriculture standpoint. Not just the lower South Platte, but all of the South Platte irrigated agriculture. I think sometimes people don't understand just how big of an issue it is. We have multiple entities out on the South Platte currently today that are purchasing water rights with that intent to dry it up to be used as a supply source. So when we went out and did our basin plan, or we're doing the scope of work, we've actually submitted that to the CWCB. We wanted to really involve all the stakeholders, have multiple stakeholder meetings, make sure that when we're looking at this gap, that it truly is the gap that, you know, that's out there. We want to really refine that, make sure that it's not just an overall gap, but it's understood where it's at, how much it is, and are there things ultimately that in basin we can do more of. But in the end, I think we need to just understand. I mean, I think from my perspective, in a lot of the South Platte Basin, we still don't fully understand the magnitude of how big of an issue it is. So I think that's our main goal here, is to understand it and to come up with ways of solving that gap that are alternatives to buy and dry.
Thank you. Jim?
Well, you are in our basin, the Colorado main stem, where we're the major donor basin of water to other basins. And yet we have our own needs. What we've learned in the Roundtable process is that we have an agricultural shortage of about 100,000 acre feet, which could be diminished to something in the 70s, depending on urbanization. We have a M&I gap, municipal and industrial gap, of about 50 to 60,000 acre feet, which could be reduced by slower population growth. And then we learned that we have potential energy needs between us and the Yampa-White Basin should there be a robust oil shale industry, or an oil shale industry at all. We are going to actually update the energy component of our own water demands. We're learning that directional drilling may be more consumptive, or is more consumptive than we initially thought, so we're going to team up with the Yampa-White and look a little bit more deeply into that. We've invested over $300,000 into trying to understand our non-consumptive needs, and we learned that we have 2,200 miles of water bodies that have issues, whether it's temperature, fish populations, cottonwood galleries, or stream bed issues. But the good news there is that 72% of them have identified processes and or projects that could help address them. So what we're charged to do, first and foremost in Colorado, our part of the Colorado Water Plan, is to look at these needs and be imaginative in ways to address solutions to fix things and prepare for the future. At the same time, we're also aware that even though we're already a donor basin, that the Colorado River, and more largely the Colorado River system, is being looked to as a potential solution to the statewide gap issues. So when we put together our basin implementation plan, we're going to be looking inwardly to try and solve issues, but we'll also be looking to what others might be thinking about our basin and how it can fulfill a role.
Thank you.
The Southwest Basin is really 9 sub-basins, and all the streams flow out of state. So we don't have a main stem tributary set up. I mean, 7 of the rivers flow south into the San Juan, and then the San Miguel and Dolores flow north and directly into the Colorado at kind of near Moab. We've also pretty aggressively, in July, launched an aggressive basin implementation plan effort, and our goal is to have our plan in draft by July 2014, so we can start to upload our top priorities into the Colorado Water Plan. So I think what the executive order and the basin implementation plans have done for us is really jump-started getting us focused on fine-tuning our gaps, which tend to be mostly irrigation and non-consumptive uses and the interrelationships between those two, and then to actually have strategies to close those gaps. So it's been good in that way. The other thing that we're trying to do is explore the 4 legs of the stool, both in basin and statewide. I'm going to go ahead and bring up new supply because the Southwest Basin is relatively unpositioned on this issue. We don't have the battle scars and battle ribbons that, kind of everybody else that's been involved in this over a long period of time have. We do want to address west slope needs. We want to avoid ag dry up, both on the west slope and the front range. We agree that basins of origin should be protected should any more water be moved across the divide. We also want to advance west slope multi-purpose storage projects and certainly get real about hydrologic variation. I mean, the Dolores project this year, I'm managing a 25% supply for irrigators and the fish. Really the only way for our subbasin to kind of get constructively engaged in this discussion is really some kind of comparative framework so that you can look at all of the alternatives that have been discussed and we can kind of share in understanding and evaluating those. I guess in that direction, I mean, we sent 3 people to the Flaming Gorge Task Force to start to get our arms around kind of how this might work. I guess one thing I would say is that as progress, as the discussion is going, I can remember Michelle Pierce and I standing up in front of the summit a couple years ago trying to spark a discussion about new supply, and the silence was deafening. That's changed quite a bit. I mean, I've seen at least 4 or 5 different principal or position drafts that we've been asked to sign on to in the last couple of weeks. So I think the discussion is well underway. We at our roundtable meeting yesterday or Wednesday, we circulated the Dan Birch draft, and it's a good one. But in order for us to kind of participate in the new supply discussion, we really do need that evaluation framework, and then we need to understand the options that are going to be under consideration relative to the Southwest Basin. So we'd like to keep the kind of the learning and the dialogue going. And again, we're happy that the dialogue is underway, but it's probably going to take us a little while to get our bearings and be able to actually sign on to some of the principal statements. But we're glad that that's happening.
Thank you, Mike. Tom?
Well, in order to not repeat a lot of what's been said, because I think as we've all spent 8 years identifying our shortages and identifying strategies to meet our needs and projects, that we've all been working within the basins, and we're all comfortable with that. In our basin, from 8 years ago to now, like I hear from my other basins, we've made a lot of progress. The non-consumptive and the consumptive users are talking and seeing how one project that will help one need can also help another one. So we feel pretty comfortable. Now, in relation to the statewide water plan, and let me just back up. We currently are most of the way through, 3/4 of the way through what we're calling a projects and methods study grant that we got through a water supply reserve account grant. And we think that's going to feed into our basin implementation plan. And then, of course, that'll be the information that we'll use to be going on into the state plans. So we think we're on schedule. However, we just had our first real serious conversations about the statewide water plan and our basin implementation plans. And I have to say that, of course, on the western slope, that first was met with, let's circle the wagons and protect our interests. It was went from that into some confusion of how are we going to do this, and how are we going to do this in such a way on our basin implementation planning that we don't give away the farm, because it felt a little bit like top down. But we are, I think, we're getting there. We made a lot of progress just in the one meeting that we had, and I believe this is just me, but because like all basins, we have differences of opinion. But the elephant in the room, whenever we sit down to talk about planning, is new supply. And I think we're struggling, but we're going to get there as far as comfort with the guidelines. As you mentioned, there's a lot of set of guidelines going around. I think that's the first step for us to get comfort and to move forward, is to get some guidelines on how this is going to look going forward. But our basin will buy in. We're going to work on it.
Good. James, you want to take 3 minutes? And then while you frame that, I just want to let you all know that we will begin the question and answer conversation with an opportunity for each of you first to ask a question of each other, of a specific basin or of the state, and then we'll open it up to the audience. James, though, 3 minutes, something you wanted to finish with?
Sure. Appreciate all the work that these folks are doing. And in the basins, this has been unrewarded, personal sacrifice type work that they've been doing. And the chairs especially deserve a lot of recognition, more recognition than you've received in the past, for doing that. So thank you to each and every one of you, and to the members that have been coming. 8 years of meetings is quite a lift. Civic engagement can happen like the TBD Colorado effort, or those can happen in relatively short time frames over a period of months or a year. But this is really fundamentally different. It's special. I mean, this is in Colorado. We have taken an opportunity that was given to us in 2005 and turned it into the conversations that you're hearing about here. And we, at some point, hopefully in December 11th, 2014, we'll stop and look back and say, this is really monumental. The Interbasin Compact Committee, for those of you who don't know the structure and the process, is comprised of 2 members from each basin, and then 5 or 6 members, that are appointed by the governor. And they have been engaged in a conversation that has been largely about finding points of consensus around the big kind of hairy obstacles in water, and they're making amazing progress. The conversations that you all are having in your basins are indicative of I think if people get the same, there's this theory out there that if people have the same facts, then whether they're Republicans or Democrats or conservatives or liberals, or they're in ag or they're in a subdivision somewhere, that if you give people the same facts, they come to more points of consensus than you would probably think. And I think that's bearing out in the water discussion. So that's one thing I'd like to say, Chris. And then the second is, really if this plan does a couple of things, 3 things really, that I tried to review in the presentation there, but that are important, I think, to stress. We've got to get our hands around this gap. We've got to do it in a way that is from the ground up. I mean, the governor could have come out with an executive order that prescribed what we were going to do and let people, shoot arrows at it and be upset about it, or he could turn it over to the people who actually live in these basins, and that was the preferred alternative. So getting our arms around the gap, and then also we have to make sure that we're talking about a future that we want to have in Colorado. We can buy and dry irrigated ag. That's the current Colorado water plan, by the way. So if we don't do anything, then that's where we're headed. We're a private property rights state. We are not suggesting in any way, shape, or form with the Colorado water plan changing that dynamic. In fact, we want to make it more robust. We want to give more tools to ag producers and municipalities to do what they need to do with water. And what I mean by that is it's a pretty stark choice right now for an ag producer on the Eastern Plains in particular, between hoping your kids come back and remain in productive agriculture, and selling the water off your land and treating it like your 401k plan. What we have an opportunity to do here is give a new tool or a new suite of tools to ag producers and municipalities so that the decision isn't so stark and the contrast isn't so stark. and that is, lease fallowing, conservation easements that tie water to the land so that this municipality can take water during times when they need it and maybe when an agricultural producer wouldn't have planned it anyway. And the municipality, the ag producer knows and their community knows that on a long-term basis, that water stays on the land and stays in the economy. So thanks for the opportunity to kind of chime in there.
All right, and I'll start back your right to left. Mark, question of another or the panel?
I guess this would go to the western slope basins and to the CWCB. Not sure if it's you, James, or everybody in general, but I think you pointed out the real struggle that we have right now in the Metro Basin, and that is if we don't have some assurance that there will be a new supply project available, ag dry up or some form of ag conversion is going to be necessary. How do we get to that point where the water suppliers in the metro area don't have to take that step of going out and starting the water project of bringing water off of ag, because water projects take a long time. With the city of Thornton, we're on one that's been going on for almost 30 years now. That's what it takes to build these water projects, and we're not even tied up in NEPA right now. That's something that might even be further down the road. But how do we get to the point where the metro area water suppliers can say, we don't need to start going out and buying ag right now for our water supply that we're going to need in 20 years? What kind of conversation do we need to have? How do we get there to say that there's some water supply available from the Colorado River Basin?
Anybody that's open to the western slope?
Well, that's an interesting question, Mark, especially not question mark, but question mark. Because of the timeline. And, so if you want to talk about a project, it's going to be 30 or 40 years with no certainty at the end of that. So to be a good business planner, you have to plan a plan B or a plan C, and that gets into the other three legs of the stool, which is conservation, reuse, and of course whatever we can do with ag to whatever is dried up, it's done in the best way possible, if there is a best way. So when we've been talking about new supply, it's we don't want to trip the Colorado River Basin into compact compliance. We don't want to kill West Slope ag. And we're concerned about the health of the river and what kind of economy is created by the non-consumptive values. So in a sense, we're trying to defend two goal lines. One of them is ag and one of them is in the river. So to get to some kind of good conversation about new supply, I guess the West Slope would like to see the other three legs of the stool being dealt with in a concerted way and with a lot of confidence, because it has to be done, I think, to create the political environment that there could be a project if there's enough water, that there could be one. In the meantime, it's in the best interest of Colorado that all the best practices and all the efficiencies and everything you do starts tomorrow. I think that's how I would start an answer. There's others.
I would like to see some definitive data on what amount of water is actually available in the Colorado River system for development. I know that there's a wide variety of studies that prove different things and even a wide variety of opinions about what is available, but to me, you can just look at the system, and we've seen pictures today of the current levels in Lake Powell, the current levels in Lake Mead, the current level in Blue Mesa Lake. And I look at that and I have to ask the question, is there water left to develop? I'm not being argumentative, and I'm certainly not being combative. I would just like to see some data that supports the fact that there is and how much. And I think once we get to that point, then we can have what I've been hearing termed as the adult conversation about how to develop that water.
James, is that part of the process, and how does that happen concurrent without waiting for an answer?
Well, you've asked the question that, and I think part of the problem is the unanswerable question, right? I mean, our 1948 Upper Colorado River Compact says that we get 51.75% of the water available for use in the Upper Basin. 51.75% of what is what you would have to know to answer your question, Michelle, and really the hydrology, as we've seen over the last handful of years and beyond, is so fluctuating and variable that it's hard to say that we have a study that we could just pump out a number and tell you the answer to that question. We have tried, and it's not something that I think we do ourselves the favor, any favors around saying that we have to have that done before we do anything, because we may never get that answer, and we have to start having the adult conversation with less than perfect information. If we could scan ahead 20 years or build a time machine and tell everybody how much water there's going to be available in the Colorado River system, and answer the questions that we heard at lunch about the levels of Lake Mead and Lake Powell, then I would agree 100% that you have to see the data, you have to analyze the heck out of it, and then you got to figure out if that's something that's acceptable risk to be borne one way or the other. But because we don't have that perfect science, and we won't ever have it, I think we do ourselves a disservice if we don't continue to talk through the issues about what an increment of water would be. Now, talking about 300,000 acre feet from the western slope, I think that's the type of thing that's a non-starter right now. I can't predict any more than I could predict the flooding that's happening over on the Front Range, what's going to happen in 50 years, but I can't say in the next 10 that we've got a future for our kids and grandkids to start planning for here, or water Darwinism, as Mike King's referred to it, kind of takes over. And that's not a future we want for Colorado. I don't want to fly into DIA and see the additional 2 million people by 2030 having that part of the state grow the way it's grown the last 10 years, or 20 or 30. We need to do things differently, and this plan is a mechanism or a vehicle for allowing us to do that. So I appreciate the comment, but I also want to make sure that we're continuing to talk and have these conversations.
Joe, you want to pose a question?
Sure. I guess I'd like to speak to the leg of the stool of the IPPs, the identified projects and processes that are out there, especially on the South Platte Basin. That is a major component to our solving our gap, and a lot of them are struggling out there. And if those aren't built, I throw out, I follow the Northern Integrated Supply Project, the NIST project. I hear somewhere around 50 to 60,000 acres of dry up just if that project isn't built, because that's the only other solution that they have are those 15 entities going out and finding more irrigated ground to dry up. So, I look at that project and I want to group them all together, but it's the same question I guess I've asked to our Basin Roundtable and really haven't gotten a solid answer. But I guess from a state perspective, I know the governor's made some comments and done some things. We appreciate that. But from a West Slope, from a statewide perspective, I think we need to have, or are there ways to have a support, because once again, there's more target, whether it's West Slope or East Slope Ag, without the development of those projects that are on the drawing board today. So I guess my question would be, how do we get those projects done?
What's interesting about that question is a lot of the opposition is in your own backyard.
Absolutely.
As it would be in our own backyard if we were going the other way. So that's a huge question for your part of the world. I don't know what the right answer is, but one of those projects is the Windy Gap Firming project, and that's where there was a negotiation with the West Slope under a business decision, a political decision by the participants to negotiate a win-win situation, whereas the West Slope, can come out feeling like there's net benefits to it, which gets back to my original concept, and that's the same business model that Denver offered up when they negotiated the Moffett project, which is another IP&P that's still not to the finish line, but at least there was a West Slope discussion along the win-win lines, and there's a almost signed agreement. So I don't know, working with inside the Front Range, I don't know what the negotiating business model is if there's enough being offered to those who are in opposition.
Mark, go ahead.
I guess as a follow-up to that, for James, what will the water plan do for us for a project like NISP or Moffett or Windy Gap firming, if those other agreements were in place? What do you see the water plan will bring to the table for project proponents to say, I've met your criteria, how are you going to help me with this?
So that slide with the big arrow that goes up and talks about our regulatory process for permitting a water project it would be an answer to your question. But, it starts with the point that I have to make, which is the water plan will not be listing, projects that are going to be endorsed and, a separate list with the projects that aren't going to be endorsed. That would get us nowhere. It would put us right back into kind of age-old disputed territory. So we're not going to be doing that. But what we can do is set out those factors that if your project's doing the right things by conservation, the environment, and building up and not out if it's an M&I project, doing all the things that we as Coloradans think of when we think of a good, diverse water project, then that certainly puts you, that project on a path to a state endorsement. So, until we get that list of factors or criteria, or whatever you want to call it, ironed out, and it'll be informed by the work you're doing, then it's hard for me to say with specifics to a specific project that, oh yeah, that's going to get the thumbs up from the state. Now, bear in mind that that's all it is. It's just it's a pathway for a state, kind of the state putting its shoulder behind a project. The federal government still has the final say on all these projects. But the point is that it's not an effective and efficient way of doing business to have what used to take for an average water project in Colorado 3 years and $3 million. Now it takes 10 years and $10 million, and it's probably going north of that through the regulatory process. So we have to address that in a way that doesn't compromise the impact on the environment and trying to make sure that the impact to the basin of origin isn't compromised in planning that project. So, I know it sounds like I'm walking around the question, but we have a list of many projects, hundreds of projects in Colorado, water projects, and we need to have a path for those so that water proponents, water providers, and project proponents can come to us and say, yeah, I could add that component. I hadn't thought of it, or I can add that component sooner than I otherwise would have if it means that the state's going to get behind me in my project. So that's my answer to the question.
Okay. Jim, a quick question?
Yeah, I have a question, and it's for my brother on the West Slope, Mike. The Colorado River Basin and the Roundtable and the River District are, pretty concerned about long-term water supply projections and what a new supply project would do. And some might say some in your basin might say we're alarmist, or maybe we think the sky is falling. And I've heard those words, but in the Southwest, perhaps isn't as concerned or doesn't think the sky is falling. What is the view in the Southwest toward these critical questions?
Well, I think that certainly we share, we rely on Colorado River water. We've got, compact issues, and just like everyone else does. And I think I mean, actually, we're trying to sort this out. Because, I mean, now that everything is kind of coming out in the open, and in other words, the principal statements and the issue papers and everything, those things make sense. I mean, in other words, the questions that are being raised are legitimate questions, including, the one raised by Michelle. And so I think we're really interested in really the analysis of those questions and the kind of information and evaluation that it would take to take the concerns that you're raising and understand the magnitude of them, and think about either what kind of alternatives would actually address this gap. So I think we're pretty new to this. We're somewhat naive, and we're really kind of waiting for information that we can use to try and evaluate those considerations.
So we can rest more easily. You're not going rogue on us.
No, we're not. I mean, we're just trying to. I mean, as I said earlier, it's going to take us some time to sort through this because it's new. We're not positioned. And I think I ticked off concerns that we share, and I throw species. We got species concerns as well. So yeah, I think we do have a common set of concerns, and I guess I would maybe ask you back. How do you see I mean, we're also concerned about by and dry. Kind of what's your sense of how that gets dealt with?
Well, I think it's probably being underdealt with, and I think as we develop our basin BIP, I'll just say that. I think we have to take a bigger swan dive into that issue. And at another level, I attended, an IBCC New Supply Committee, and there's a lot of passion and paranoia and concern there whether new supply is really going to get seriously talked about. Then I heard a Front Range comment similar to how long it takes to get a project done. And I'm thinking, oh well, gosh, the target is even bigger on ag than ever, and I would hope that this process. Ag is getting as much attention and concern and hand-wringing as a new supply project because it's right there right now. It's on the meat hook, ready to be skinned. And to that degree, if Gary Barber was here, he'd plug the October 7th Valuing of Agriculture workshop that's being held in Colorado Springs. I wish I knew a website I could send you to. But I see Carlisle Courier's in the back. Perhaps he can point to the information.
Colorado Ag Water Alliance, if you go to their website.
coagwater.org, I think, is it.
Good, perfect. Mike, we can let that stand for now as your question. Tom, a last question before I open it to the audience?
Yeah, I have a question for Joe and Mark, and maybe ultimately it would be something James might want to respond to. But just from a pragmatic look, and you were asking Joe, and I'm really sympathetic to that. How are we going to get our IPPs in place so we don't dry up more ag? And but the big question for me is, right now and for the foreseeable future, there's no proponent that can afford another Trans Mountain diversion, even if there was one, if it could be streamlined. And the cheapest water for the municipalities is ag water. So what is the statewide water plan going to ultimately end up with that addresses that conundrum of money, which is it's the big question in my mind.
I guess I'd respond first to the statement about ag being the cheapest water. In the South Platte, and it's not necessarily the cheapest water just because there's so many issues involved with it. I mean, it's not clean water, so you've got to treat it, and you've got to provide reverse osmosis more than likely. That involves a very expensive step there. The NIST project, what I've heard, getting back to that project, that's a $450 million project. If all the parties come together and build that project, it doubles that amount if they have to go out and individually go dry up ag, treat the water, do a change case, all the pipelines, all the structures that are involved with that component of it. So I think there's, I think it depends on the specifics of the projects and the strength in numbers on different projects, but ag's not necessarily always the cheapest, and I'll leave it at that, I guess.
Quick answer, though, from my side. It might not be the cheapest, but right now, it's the one that's doable.
It's the easiest.
And so that's what people pursue. It's because it's something you can do, you can get done, you can count on it getting done just by, if it ends up, you have to pay the money to get it done for reverse osmosis or something, you know that that's out there, you know what it's going to cost, and you proceed down the line to get it done.
Mike, thought?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I can't pass this up because this just came up in our roundtable yesterday. I'd really like to ask Joe and Mark. I mean, the question that came up in our roundtable is, who are the entities that are doing the buy and dry? In other words, where is that going on? And either through a large project or a series of smaller projects, how do you really match new supply or IPPs with those places where the dry up is actually going on?
It's a good question, and it's one of my points that I missed in going over this. In the South Platte, we have a piecemeal group of entities. I mean, you have the Denver Waters, the Aurora, some bigger water providers, but you also have a bunch of smaller providers that don't have that ability. So you have the United Water and Sanitation District going out and grabbing water. You've got the Renaissance Group. You've got entities like Thornton and Aurora, others that have went out and bought up ground. And on the South Platte, it's not as visible as the Arkansas yet because a lot of that ground's been purchased with the intent of 10, 15, 20 years down the road drying that ground up. So there are so many entities. I mean, I think, in our area, Parker Water and Sanitation is another one. They've bought up several acres down in the Sterling area. So just to name a few, I think it's going on quite a bit, and I think that's what we kind of want to look at a little bit in our basin implementation plan is where are the gaps exactly? We have this idea of we've got large gap in this area in the county or in the basin, but specifically where are the gaps from these smaller water providers or grouped together so that we can start looking at it. Are there ways of pooling people together so that there are things that can be done other than buy and dry? Are there not just the existing IPPs, but are there new ways of working together? I mean, the WISE partnerships that's coming together with South Metro and Denver and Aurora, and other types of those type of things that can maybe work in basin first, and then, but in the end, I think without some new supply, whether we're going to, I think we're going to try and turn every stone over in our own basin, but without some new supply, we're still looking at large scale dry up of agriculture.
Michelle, I heard a question at the end of your answer to Mark. Was that not your question?
No, I was responding to him.
Okay, go ahead then. I'm sorry.
Well, and I think it's just been touched on here in this little discussion here. My question is, given the fact that even if there was a new supply project that everybody agreed to today, there was a project proponent and there was money, my understanding is that it'd take about 50 years to construct. So with that in mind, can Eastern Slope agriculture actually be saved? It seems to me that's going to take too long.
Go ahead, James. A few minutes, and then we want to open it up to...
Yeah, real quickly. The South Platte Basin, as John Stoltz told me, and it's flabbergasting every time I say it, or I hear him say it, it's that 20% of currently irrigated land under production is already spoken for, to Joe's point, which is, you don't see it because the water hasn't been taken off yet. But when, Thornton went up to Weld County, as Mark knows, and purchased, the farms up there, they leased back the farm to the farmer so that the community really didn't know that there was an impact there. And moreover, and this goes to a point I wanted to get in there, we're not going to stop the continued buy and dry of irrigated ag. It's just not going to happen. We don't have the tools to do it, and we don't have the legal structure to do it, nor do we want the legal structure to do that. You don't want the state saying picking winners and losers and telling people who can buy and who can sell water. What we can do is when a municipality does go into an ag community and purchases the land or the water on a permanent buy and dry type of transaction, they do the things that are in the kind of the best management practices. And Thornton has illustrated some of those. You continue to pay ad valorem property taxes, or taxes and fees in lieu of taxes into the system in Weld County. They've done that voluntarily. There's no legal requirement for them to do that. But they do it because they know that there's a ripple effect from taking water off of the land, and that ripple effect hits the John Deere dealership because they're not selling as many implements. It hits the corner restaurant and the grocery store and the school district, and the list goes on and on. Recognizing that, and then making sure when we do buy and dry, we're doing it the right way, as opposed to the way that you wake up and then the entire community's dried up overnight. We've got to avoid that. But ag, the market's going to control the vast majority of these transactions, and this won't change that. What we're hoping to do is influence them a little bit, so that the farmer with the stark contrast between, do I hope my kids come back and do I buy, or do I sell my water off the land, has, if it was $100,000, let's say, for their water portfolio, for a permanent buy and dry situation, maybe they'd take 80 or 70 or something less than 100 if they could be assured that the water was tied to the land and it would stay in agricultural production for the long term. Yeah, it might be taken off in drought years when a city might need it to firm up their supply, but those are the kind of tools that we can use to kind of incentivize the transactions that we would like to see. But there's no mandate, there's no legal authority for us to go require those transactions to look a certain way or to be between certain people.
All right, let me go to the audience. And if you'd raise your hand and wait until a microphone gets to you so I don't mangle and misrepresent your question. Representative, and thank you, Representative, for staying with us the entire day. Appreciate it.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Thanks for the program today. I think it's a great learning tool. I have some concerns that I would like to address. What I'm hearing is that we're all concerned about how we move the water to the people, i.e. Front Range, Las Vegas, and the time constraints of new projects. What I would like for you to consider is maybe it's a whole lot cheaper to move the people to the water. I would hope that you would work with economic development and try to stimulate an economy where we have a Colorado economy, not an I-25 corridor economy. So I would really hope that you would consider that as an option.
Anybody? Is that within the scope of your roundtable plans, basin plans? James, is that reasonable within a state water plan?
Well, I appreciate the comment, Representative. Is this your plan to get more constituents? I'm joking.
I don't think Mark Catlin's the only one in the room, and I'm not sure he's going to vote for him.
He said Mark Catlin's the only one in the room, and he's not sure he's going to vote for him. So anyway.
I'll vote for you.
Anyway, the question is, a good one. And as a person from the Western Slope, I think Koleber could probably handle a few more people, but I don't know where you draw that line. I know that one of the things that makes Denver, and Colorado is you get away from people in this state. You can get into a backyard that is, the Rocky Mountain West that is special, and that's what makes us different in Denver and Colorado from Kansas and Topeka, because you can get out and see these mountains and enjoy this resource that we have. So I appreciate it. It's a little too ambitious. Our plan has been, I think, would go maybe a bridge too far if by 2014 we had taken on the population control question. But I get where you're coming from with the question. I appreciate it.
Anybody? Rachel?
Thank you. other than ag efficiency and new supply? Things like community mill levies or taxes, so that you can buy an agricultural easement and keep the water on land and help the farmer or rancher receive some remuneration for the decades of life on the farm without having to sell the water and keep them there. And is that something that we should really be adding to our portfolio the same way we do open space conservation?
That's a great question, and actually we've had these discussions on our South Platte Basin Roundtable. I know the Arkansas Basin Roundtable is looking at a pilot project with the CWCB with conservation easements, where they actually work with the municipality in being able to lease in an interruptible supply type agreement 3 out of 10 years or something like that. But I know John McLeod brought this issue up at Water Congress about, if we're doing all this, are we really saving ag into the future, or is this going to are we just pushing the problem down the road until the next crisis comes up? And so I think it's got a lot of merit, conservation easements, whether it's the state as a whole. I mean, do we value ag enough to where we'll, as taxpayers, put in money so that that we can buy a perpetual easement on a farm, or the municipalities contribute so that they have a perpetual right to maybe lease some of that water, or other entities out there or the community itself, like you said, put some money out there so that we could pay the farmer a portion of whatever his water would be worth to do that. Obviously, that's a voluntary system or easement. I mean, you're going to have, not all of the farmers are going to want to do that. I know Jim Yon, who sits on our Basin Roundtable, has actually already put a conservation easement on his land to where he can do an interruptible supply, a 3 and 10 year lease agreement. So he did it with the Colorado Open Land. So I think that's got a lot of merit. I think we need to continue that discussion. And that's something that we actually have in our Basin implementation plan, to look at conservation easements a little further along and see how much merit that does have in the road and down the future.
Yeah, we have an organization called the Montezuma Land Conservancy, and their priority is really conservation easements on agricultural land, and many of them are purchased, and the money comes from a combination of GOCO and the Farmland Protection Program. And one of the ways it's been really helpful, and it's preserved some of the very large ranches, like in the Dolores Valley, which is again good for water quality in McPhee. By doing these purchased easements, oftentimes it's really helpful to the family, because you have lands being passed down. You have some people in the family that want to continue to ranch. You have others that have gone elsewhere, and they have their part of the legacy. And so I've seen some really fairly good resolutions where the family members who want to continue to ranch can do that, and they can settle matters with the rest of the family. So I think purchase easements is at least one tool, and we need to keep GOCO on that track and keep the Farmland Protection Program going as well.
It's all about money, Rachel, and there's going to be competition for that money, whether those who want to build new supply. I know that looking at the examples that we have in our own valley, the Mesa Valley, or the Mesa County Land Trust and Aspen Valley Land Trust, they've done great work, but it's all about money, and that's a difficult question, especially with, as you've pointed out, in transportation issues, education issues, and so that's the $64 million question, so to speak. And but I do know that, talking about conservation, the CWCB has excellent information on conservation, and some of the base level stuff has to do with fixing leaks in systems, working on rates, infrastructure problems, and let alone all the cool things that we could do as we saw today. There's so much that can be done with infrastructure, but there's no revenue stream for that either. So I think your real question is, what about money?
Let me go back out. Bonnie?
Yeah, so we heard the great presentation about the Sterling Ranch, and we're talking about how we identify new supplies, particularly on the Front Range, where there's a lot more rain than there is over here. What about using that system of rainwater collection to help offset some of the needs? Let every homeowner build a cistern to water their yards with. Wouldn't that save a tremendous amount of water in the municipal system. Has there been any consideration or any exploration of that opportunity?
James, you want to take that?
And then I know Joe was going to raise the microphone and say the exact same thing that I'm about to say. So, Bonnie, it's a good question. And that's why the pilot statute was, made it through the legislature, and that bill made it through and into statute. And Sterling Ranch is taking that and running with it. The issue isn't really if you could do it on a system where there's no return flow impact at all, like Sterling Ranch. I think it's kind of common sense and it makes sense, and you've got to look at ways to do it. The issue is when it does impact the return flow regime, because I can put my rain barrel out at 6th and Colorado in Denver, and my neighbors can all do the same thing. And then before you know it, the entire metropolitan area has got rainwater harvesting, and we would have done, it would have been a banner couple of days here recently. But eventually, when you're not having banner years, and those return flows are dependent, are required really for the people in the lower part of the system, that's when the rubber meets the road, and that's when you get into an issue of injury to somebody lower down than you are. So it does make a lot of sense from a conservation standpoint, from an efficiency standpoint, to really know and push the limit of how far you can go with that. But we can't do it at the sacrifice of people that have come into the priority system and that depend on those return flows, and add to it if you need to. Jerry.
Well, I think on the South Platte Basin, it's I would just guess, I don't even know, at least 95% of the time we're living on a call, some type of call, downstream call. There's water shortage. I mean, like when I asked the question, I mean, today, yeah, would be a great day to do rainwater harvesting. It's free river. There's too much water in the river, but that is very rare in the South Platte Basin. And so it's the same. I mean, I know that the ag efficiency question, I'll throw that out there on the South Platte, I think is a misunderstood idea out there, because that impacts somebody else's downstream water right. And so it comes back to the replacement water. So in Sterling Ranches or any other case, do they have enough water to replace that? So and in some cases, or they would be able to capture that water and not need to replace. But in a lot of the time, there's going to be somebody that they would be impacting downstream that's water right is in priority and theirs is not. So reuse is another issue in the basin. It's legal to do reuse, but it's not like it produces a whole lot more water in the basin. Somebody else is reusing their reusable supply, but that supply over time had been part of the base supply, got counted in the base supply. So somebody reuses that water, it actually impacts somebody else. Yeah, that system, let's say Thornton reuses all their water, it's going to actually impact some other city whose base supply, or some farm or some agriculture producer whose base supply gets cut. So that our basin is so intertwined together that you have to actually look at it at a macro level, not just the micro level.
One last question, and mindful that we're already over time, but I think that's a good conversation. It's important, and hopefully you all agree. I can't see who it is. I just see a. Go ahead.
Jim. I guess it's more a reminder than a question. I couldn't help but think as we were having listening to the dry discussion and mitigation for doing that. And certainly, at least to my knowledge, the property taxes are mitigated in most of these instances, and that's good. But it ignores, I think, another economic component in these communities, where particularly in places like the Lower Arctic, those ag operations are largely importers of dollars into the community. And those dollars turn over 2 or 3 times, generate sales taxes and business and those sorts of things. And those are not mitigated. And I think that's the tragedy in the Lower Arctic, is you can mitigate the property tax, you can keep the schools full, you can keep counties full, but the sales tax and economic activity is brought into the community because of the sale of ag products goes away permanently.
Secondary impacts. Could a water plan have a new best managements or minimum standards practice when ag is taken out of production?
Well, we look forward to hearing any and all ideas that come from the basin implementation plans themselves in each of the basins that deal with these issues on the ground. But there are a few lessons that we can learn. I mean, there are actually in the Colorado River Basin down in Imperial Valley, San Diego does this kind of fallowing program down there where they pump a bunch of money into an account, and then Imperial Irrigation has to go then to its producers and when they fallow the land, distribute that money. And then there's enough money in there to go to the John Deere dealership. And that process is pretty interesting. And I'm not up to speed on it as I used to be a couple of years ago. But the last time I heard about it, they were really having a hard time divvying up the money. Then, maybe we learn a few things about how to set up a compensation bank or something like that for a municipality that's willing to enter into a transaction like that. But we need to be learning. It's not just in Colorado that this stuff's going on, and we need to be learning from our neighbors, I think.
Any final thoughts? Pressing issues? Words of wisdom?
Can I just tie the representative and Rachel's question together real quick? There's this idea that it's not an idea, it's a fact. It's really hard to enter into ag as a young person who doesn't come into it. There's somebody that I'm going to butcher this, but there are 3 ways to get into ag. The womb, the tomb, or the womb, the tomb. John Stolten knows what I'm talking about, I think. Okay, I'll just say it's 2. The womb or the tomb. So, it's hard to get in to that business. And if we could put into getting back to the economic development question, if we could incentivize, not that's necessarily going to be in the plan or anything, but if you could set up a system where you incentivized young people in the municipalities who would love to go out and be in Brighton or be somewhere on the Eastern Plains farming, and they just can't because it's too big of a capital investment up front. If we could reduce those barriers to entry, maybe you'd get more people moving to places that are seeing population decline and getting into these industries that we all want as Coloradans. We want a vibrant, and we want our own food, and we want it grown here. And we need to be thinking creatively about that, and that's why I'm really excited about the basin implementation plans, because the basins are where they're the incubators for good ideas, and we get the easy job of just taking good ideas and making sure they get put into a readable framework.
Thank you all. Please join me in thanking the chairs for all they do, for their thoughts, the executive director.